Well, hello everyone, how's it going? Phil here. Do you like cars? I kind of do like them. What do you think about electric cars? I quite like those, honestly. They're quite a lot cleaner to run than internal combustion engine cars. They're a bit dirtier to produce though, but it's quite a slim margin. It's about 8 to 9 US tons of CO2 emitted compared to around 7 for an internal combustion engine powered car. Now, according to the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is a think tank, it takes between 6 and 16 months to recoup from the higher emissions of producing an electric vehicle, depending on, well, the type of electric car and the country in which it is produced and or the country in which it is driven. Also, it's worth pointing out that this estimate is from 2015, which is, well, 6 years ago. Now we're in 2021. And so now the difference is likely quite a lot slimmer, although I couldn't find precise estimates for it. So what's your favorite EV? Mine is the Mustang Mach-E, pretty unpopular opinion probably, but I also like the Honda E for no particular reason and the Tesla Model 3 quite a lot. Talking about Tesla, it's easy to argue that the Model 3 is probably the poster child for the electric car market at the moment. And I'm saying this because of just how popular it is. In 2020, apparently Tesla managed to sell 365,000 of those, so like 1,000 per day. And this apparently makes it the best-selling electric vehicle in the world for that year. Followed then by the Wuling Hongguang Mini EV, sorry for potentially mispronouncing it, which I quite like, by the way, shame it isn't for sale where I live, and the Renault Zoe, which I instead really can't like, and so shame it is for sale where I live at the moment. And they're in a distant second and third place respectively, both selling about 100,000 units each. It is also interesting to note that while worldwide car sales have been declining sharply by almost 25% in 2020, due in large part to the COVID-19 pandemic, electric car sales increased by almost 43%. Here's a source for it. This is kind of telling us that the bulk of the buyers of EVs is still quite a wealthy audience, as it doesn't really seem to be particularly impacted by the pandemic-induced recession. Also, let me say props to The Guardian for mentioning right at the beginning of this article that it is dated. You have to love these journalists, honestly, whether you agree with their opinions and political stances or not, they really take their work very seriously. So, what if you do need a car? Want to be environmentally friendly, but really can't afford to get a new electric car? Well, you do what everyone did back in the day in the past and still does when they could not afford a new car. You buy a pre-owned one. I think we're more or less on the same page if I tell you that it takes effort to produce something new. And certainly more than using something that already exists. Effort in this case stands for energy, which usually, unfortunately, still translates to harmful emissions. Yes, we're back talking about those again, but we also know that running a petrol or diesel-powered car translates directly into emissions. For the sake of simplicity, we will only focus on CO2 in this video, not because it's the only harmful emission to come out from either of those processes, on the contrary actually, but because it's relatively easy to quantify and it will help me prove a point later on, so just keep that in mind. So, I've mentioned earlier that Tesla Model 3 as the best-selling EV in the world of 2020, and therefore we will assume we are on the market for a mid-size saloon car, or possibly small size if you live in the US, something like a BMW 3 Series or a Mercedes C-Class, just to understand each other. According to the study I referenced earlier, here it is again, producing a brand new EV causes the emission of around 8 to 9 tons of CO2, depending on battery capacity, car size, country of manufacturing, etc. Also, to be fair, they weren't too clear about which tons they were using. I assumed because it's an American think tank, they were using US tons, and so I converted everything to metric because I'm not American. here's the conversion factor. I hope I didn't mess it up and not then convert metric tons to more metric tons. Fingers crossed. Just to make things clear beforehand, I'm going to reference this analysis to the UK, just because it's the country whose data I'm the most familiar with. In the end, it won't really matter, but I just thought I should make this clear in the beginning. We can easily find out how much an internal combustion engine powered car will emit for each kilometer or mile driven based on the manufacturer declared data on fuel economy and based on the emission regulation, like Euro 6 or Euro 5 if you're in Europe, that was valid when the car was homologated. We can thus calculate how many kilometers or miles it needs to cover to emit the 7.257 to 8.165 tons of CO2 necessary to produce a new electric vehicle. How emissions per kilometer or mile are based on manufacturer data on fuel economy, which are notoriously overstated, as car manufacturers are masters at creating engine maps that excel at the fuel economy tests performed by government agencies around the world. The best guess I found for average overstatement is 15% to 25%, depending on the car manufacturer, the car itself, the engine it mounts, the gearbox, the traction, the country in which the test is performed, the test itself, blah, blah, blah. Let's just take 20% higher emissions than what is declared by the manufacturers, otherwise we're never coming out of this rabbit hole. Also, we won't be considering any hybrid vehicle, only petrol and diesel. And this is because emissions from those cars are widely understated by manufacturers, but unlike with petrol and diesel cars, there's no real systematic that we can trust, yet at least. We're going to be using the emission data from these 10 cars from 2020, 2015 and 2010, with the exception of the Alfa Romeo Giulia in 2015 and 2010, and Jaguar XE in 2010, as those cars weren't in production during those years. The cars were chosen to be comparable to a Tesla Model 3 in size and practicality, give or take, and to have 10 cars produced by 10 different manufacturing groups. So, like the Audi A4 is the only car from the VW group, the Peugeot 508 is the only car from the PSA group, and etc, etc, etc. This was in order not to have cars which mounted the same engines, although some small overlap is still present, specifically between Ford and Mazda, which shared the L series / Duratec engines on some models. But that's the only one that occurs, I promise. Audi was chosen as representative of the VW group, as it is the one that mounted the widest variety of engines outside of the infamous 2-liter TDI, which was object of the Dieselgate dumpster fire, which I of course excluded from this list. I mean, it's not like you can actually buy any of the cheating engines anymore anyways, not with the cheating engine maps, but whatever, let's avoid any possible controversy and exclude them. Emissions from each car don't just depend on the model used, they also depend on the specific engine it mounts. So in order to avoid excessive cluttering of the data, I avoided using brackets in the final results and instead went for a weighted average approach. So according to past sales data, it is a decent assumption to say that the lowest powered engines, which in our dataset always corresponded to the ones with the lowest emissions, I wonder why they were chosen this way, the cars, were sold more or less 10 times as much as the most powerful engines. So I used this formula to calculate how much each car model emits on average. I realize it is quite a broad approach, but it just makes the data easier to understand in the end. And finally, let me point out that as most powerful car, I decided not to include any performance-oriented variant, so no 3 Series BMW with an M badge, no Audi A4 that starts with an S or RS, no AMG Mercedes, etc, etc. This was because those cars are pretty much never used for daily driving purposes. I mean, I'm sure somebody does actually, But they're such a small minority, I reckon, that considering them in these calculations will just produce some spurious results. Fight me on this approach, though, please. So, it took a while to describe everything, and let's get results now, because they're exciting, I promise. So, from the table you can see the emissions from these cars that are all fairly aligned, though some interesting patterns can be observed. Some cars, for instance, have gotten more efficient over the last 10 years, as it would be expected. Look at the BMW 3 Series, for example. Each one of those values represent a different generation, with a partially different, more efficient engine range. Others instead have gotten worse over time, such as the Jaguar XC, which lost its smallest engine between 2015 and 2020, or the Volvo S60, which gained a plug-in hybrid version that I already said we're ignoring today. Now keep in mind that manufacturers have some leeway into how much CO2 each car can emit into the atmosphere, as they are mostly tied to fleet-wide restrictions more than regulations on each individual car. Thus, introducing some electric or hybrid vehicles to their range is usually a good excuse to discontinue some of their more efficient engines, which is exactly what Volvo and Jaguar did, for example. They belong to the same group, to be fair, but use different engines, so again, they don't clash with our previous assumption on engine range. This explains, by the way, the higher emissions in 2020 than in 2015. Now, we know that an average driver in the UK drove for 11,152 kilometers, or these many miles, in 2019. This number has been steadily dropping by about 83 kilometers, or these many miles, each year since the early noughties. In 2020, the drop was a lot more pronounced. The drop was indeed until 9,536 kilometers, or this many miles. But that was, of course, because of the COVID-19 pandemic-related lockdowns. We don't know how much those changes will be permanent, thus, just to be safe, we're going to pretend that after that drop everything will go back to normal, which is probably incorrect. Some ripple effects will be felt for years, definitely, but you will see why it won't matter in the end for the sake of this study, by the way. These numbers translate to these many grams of CO2 emitted each year by an average UK driver using each one of the cars that we decided to consider for this study. In turn, these emissions, if we assume each new electric vehicle to require circa 7.25 tons of CO2 to be emitted in the atmosphere, will take these many years for each of the internal combustion engine powered cars to equal. The lowest value is associated to the Alfa Romeo Giulia, with a bit less than 3.5 years, which was kind of expected, by me at least, for stereotypes, and which is also equal though by a 2010 Mazda 6, which was less expected, again by stereotypes. The best values instead are the more than 5 years taken by a 2015 Vauxhall Insignia or by the Jaguar XC. Most cars hover between high 3s and 4.5 years anyways. So assuming the average UK driver decides to switch to electric and buys a new electric car, in about 4 years and change, they will have completely recouped from the CO2 that they would have emitted if they instead bought a second-hand internal combustion engine powered saloon car. From there onwards, though, it's only downhill. The balance will quickly start tipping in favor of the EV. That is, of course, unless they drive for more than the average UK driver, in which case it takes even less time. So that's quite good, actually. So where does this lead us? Well, first of all, we can derive a formula from the procedure we just described. Here it is. Capital T is the time required for the second-hand internal combustion engine powered car to equal the CO2 necessary to be emitted in order to produce a brand new EV. CO2 new EV is said amount of CO2. What did you expect? So the 7.25 and change tons that we use isn't really that relevant. We can change that number very easily. Down below instead we have E, which are the grams of CO2 emitted by the internal combustion engine powered car each kilometer or mile. and D, which is the amount of kilometers or miles driven by the driver each year. If we look at the measurement units, like high school hopefully taught us to do, we see that the result is indeed in years. So, yay! So let's try applying this formula to a single case study, rather than the averages we have discussed earlier. Let's say that I need to change my car. Let's assume I am working from home because of the ongoing pandemic, that I thus only drive 6,000 kilometers each year, and that I also need a relatively spacious car because I have a family with 2 kids, that I really fancy a Tesla Model 3, but at the moment I really can't afford a new car. Some of these facts might be true, some might be false. You decide which is which, I don't care. Between the cars listed here, I really like the Jaguar XC and the Mercedes C-Class. Personally, I have a weird soft spot for the current generation Mondeo, and I'm quite indifferent towards all the other cars in this list, apart from the Audi A4 and the Alfa Romeo Giulia, which just feel lame as butts to me. Don't ask me why, I don't know and I don't care. So let's say I find a nice 2010 Mercedes C220 CDI saloon with a diesel engine that emits 127 grams of CO2 per kilometer for £5,000. It's quite the bargain if you ask me. By applying our formula, it will take me 9.5 years before I equal the amount of CO2 emitted in order to produce a brand new electric vehicle. And this is quite a high number, and it's driven mostly by the fact that I, supposedly at least, drive quite less than the average UK motorist. So actually, for a driver like myself, the best option seems to be
a second-hand electric car.
Yeah, you noticed it as well, didn't you? There are also other options outside of the two we have discussed so far. Let's take a look at some alternatives. We have already mentioned how buying a second-hand electric car would be the best of both worlds. Unfortunately, for the same budget, £5,000, the best I could find were a few base model Nissan Leaf or Renault Zoes with circa 150 kilometers of range when new, as declared by the manufacturer. Real-world measurements put them closer to 110 and 120 kilometers. When new, again, so it might have dropped a bit. And those cars also are quite a lot smaller than a Mercedes C-Class. So it's evident that the pre-owned electric car market is still not really up to speed with the exigence of the average motorist. So what other options do we have? Unfortunately, quite a lot. First of all, if I lied about my family and instead lived alone, I might not need all that much space. If I lived in an area with decent cycling infrastructures, I could just go for a bike or an e-bike. Unfortunately, in the UK, e-scooters are not allowed on the road, so those are not an option yet. But what about this? This is a Yamaha NMAX 125. It can be driven with a standard car license, and it has a tested, so yes, for real, tested fuel economy of 96 mpg, which is better than most hybrid cars in the real world, without the need for a battery. And it can also easily be found second-hand for 2,300, £2,500 at most. Half of all the cars that we have looked at so far. So that's quite the bargain, if you ask me. It's also good for the environment with that fuel economy. It's worth pointing out, though, that motorcycles are not tied to the same exact emission regulations that are imposed on cars. They kind of lag a bit behind, so the jury's still out on that fuel economy, like how much it translates into emissions in the real world. So I just thought I should point this out. So what to make of all of this? Well, a couple of points. First, if you can afford a new electric car, by all means, that's great. Go for it. They're fantastic. They're getting more eco-friendly by the year, and they will also help build a stronger second-hand market. And by the end of your first year or so of ownership, you will have already recouped from the higher emissions related to its production compared to a new internal combustion engine equipped car. Second, if you can't afford one, though, look at bicycles or e-bikes or small scooters and motorcycles. They might already be enough for your personal needs, and plus, you also won't be contributing to congestion. An electric car, of course, would, because it's still, a car. Third, if you said really need a car, you might find a feasible pre-owned electric car, but it's still not that likely, at least at the time of filming, so it's mid-2021 right now. And finally, fourth, look at the second-hand market for petrol, diesel, or hybrid-powered cars. There's plenty of great options, tens of thousands of those indeed, in the UK at least, without the need to use precious resources to produce something from scratch. So, all things considered, it looks as if the real conclusion is this video. It really isn't in favor of one option over the other. There's way too many variables to look at, which depend on the single vehicle and the single road user. And we haven't even looked at the other harmful emissions caused by internal combustion engines, just as we did not consider, for instance, the impact of battery production. Those are a whole different business again. It's messed up. The only option that seems to be losing on all fronts right now is buying a new petrol or diesel powered car, which also is not going to be possible in the UK from 2030 onwards. Though let me also add a personal note here. I guess that the real conclusion of this video is that we don't just need to move away from fossil fuel powered cars. We also need to consider that we might not need to produce so much new shit in order to do so. Guess that's a good point to end this video. Bye everyone, chill out. Thank you once again for watching until the end. These are the main sources used in the research for this video. And if you have any questions, please pop them in the comments and let's start a discussion.